This just in one of the most symbolically charged targets in Israel has come under attack, and the shockwaves are moving far beyond Tel Aviv. As of the 26th of March, 2026, reporting from Reuters, AP, and other major outlets indicates that Iran has intensified strikes on Israeli targets during a rapidly expanding regional war, with Ben Gurion Airport now firmly at the center of the crisis narrative. Reuters has separately reported damage at or near Ben Gurion tied to Iranian missile debris, while Israeli authorities have imposed tighter airport restrictions after recent attacks. What makes this moment especially dangerous is not just the target. Ben Gurion is Israel's main international airport, a critical civilian gateway, and a strategic symbol of national connectivity, evacuation capacity, and economic stability. In recent days, authorities have sharply limited airport operations, reduced outbound passenger volumes, and reassessed aviation security conditions after Iranian strikes escalated. That means this is no longer just a military headline. It is a signal that key civilian infrastructure is now part of the pressure campaign. Now, one important caution. The exact wording in your title, multi-warhead missiles, is stronger than what I can independently confirm from the most reliable reporting right now. Reuters has confirmed major Iranian missile activity and damage linked to missile debris, while The Guardian has reported on Iranian use of cluster, style, or multi-submunition warheads during this war. But I cannot verify from the available top-tier sources that a confirmed multi-warhead missile specifically struck Ben Gurion Airport in exactly those terms. What is confirmed is that Iranian attacks have reached high-value Israeli targets. Airport restrictions have tightened, and the broader war has already disrupted air travel, energy markets, and regional security calculations. According to AP, this war has already jolted global energy markets, with Brent crude surging above $119 per barrel earlier in the escalation. Reuters has also reported that Iran fired long-range ballistic missiles for the first time in this conflict, while regional governments and global markets have been forced to respond to the expanding fallout. In other words, what happened at Ben Gurion does not sit in isolation. It connects to the possibility of wider airspace disruptions, higher oil prices, greater pressure on U.S. policy, and growing fears of an even broader Middle East confrontation. And here is why Americans should pay attention tonight. When a major regional war threatens aviation routes, energy supply chains, and military postures across the Middle East, the effects do not stay overseas. They can show up in fuel prices, market volatility, emergency diplomacy, and potentially in U.S. military decision-making. This is exactly the kind of development that can move from foreign crisis to domestic political issue in a matter of hours. If you want fact-based coverage without the noise, subscribe now, because the timeline behind this attack, the strategic value of Ben Gurion, and the competing claims about what exactly was launched are where this story becomes even more important. This section follows the structure from your uploaded master prompt. To understand how a strike tied to Ben Gurion Airport became part of a rapidly escalating confrontation, we need to step back, because this did not begin overnight. The roots of this crisis stretch across decades of tension between Iran and Israel, shaped by proxy conflicts, intelligence operations, and an ongoing shadow war that has periodically erupted into open confrontation. For years, Israel has viewed Iran's regional influence and missile capabilities as an existential threat. Iran, in turn, has positioned itself as a counterforce to Israeli and U.S. presence in the Middle East. This rivalry has played out not just through direct threats, but through cyber operations, targeted strikes, and proxy groups operating across Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Gaza. But here's where the timeline accelerates. In the weeks leading up to this moment, intelligence signals and regional movements suggested a shift from indirect confrontation to something far more direct. Reports from Reuters and Associated Press indicated increased military readiness across multiple fronts. Israeli defense systems were placed on higher alert. Iran, meanwhile, signaled through state messaging and regional positioning that it was prepared to escalate if provoked. Then came the trigger phase day one. Initial strikes and counterstrikes begin to surface across the region. Early reports suggest targeted operations involving strategic sites, though both sides release limited and carefully controlled information. Day three, the scale of engagement increases. Long-range missile activity is reported, marking a shift from localized operations to broader military signaling. Analysts begin to warn that the conflict is moving beyond containment. Day five, regional actors start reacting. Airspace restrictions begin appearing across parts of the Middle East. Airlines review routes. Energy markets respond almost immediately, reflecting fears of disruption. Day seven, the situation reaches a new threshold. Reports emerge linking Iranian missile activity to high-value Israeli infrastructure. Restrictions tighten at Ben Gurion Airport. Flights are limited. Security protocols intensify and, now this moment, what we are seeing is not an isolated strike, but the culmination of a rapidly escalating sequence. Each step in the timeline has moved both sides closer to direct confrontation, reducing the space for de-escalation and increasing the risk of miscalculation. But that's only part of the story, because understanding the timeline explains how we got here, but it does not explain exactly what happened during the strike itself. And that's where things become far more contested, far more complex, and far more critical to analyze now to the moment itself, what actually happened and why the details remain so heavily contested. As of this hour, multiple reports from Reuters and Associated Press confirmed that Iranian missile activity reached Israeli territory during this phase of the conflict, with debris and impact zones linked to areas near Ben Gurion Airport. Israeli authorities responded immediately by tightening airspace controls and restricting airport operations, signaling that the threat level had crossed into critical civilian infrastructure risk. But here's where the story splits into competing narratives. Step-by-step breakdown, according to early intelligence. Linked reporting. The sequence began with the launch of multiple long-range projectiles from Iranian, controlled or aligned positions. These were believed to be part of a coordinated strike package, designed not only to reach Israeli territory, but to test or overwhelm layered air defense systems. Israeli defense systems, including missile interception platforms, were activated within seconds. Interception attempts were reported, with some projectiles successfully neutralized mid-air. However, not all threats were fully contained. Fragments described in reports as missile debris were confirmed to have landed in or near sensitive zones, including areas surrounding Ben Gurion Airport. This triggered immediate emergency protocols. Flights were halted or restricted. Ground operations were reassessed. Civilian aviation safety became the top priority. What Israel says, Israeli officials maintain that the majority of incoming threats were intercepted. They emphasize that while debris caused localized disruption, the country's defense systems prevented catastrophic damage to critical infrastructure. The official narrative focuses on resilience, highlighting the effectiveness of interception systems and rapid response measures. Authorities have also framed the strike as a deliberate attempt by Iran to target civilian infrastructure and create psychological pressure. What Iran signals Iran has not always provided direct detailed confirmation of specific targets in real time. However, state-linked messaging and regional reports suggest that these strikes are part of a broader strategic response, intended to demonstrate reach, deterrence, and the ability to impact high-value locations inside Israel. Some narratives aligned with Iranian perspectives frame the strikes as precision-based and justified within the context of ongoing hostilities. What we know and what we don't confirmed, missile activity reached Israeli territory. Impact related debris was linked to areas near Ben Gurion Airport. Airport operations were restricted as a direct response. Air defense systems were actively engaged, uncertain. The exact number of missiles launched weather. All projectiles were intercepted or partially penetrated defenses. The specific warhead configuration used in this strike weather Ben Gurion Airport was the primary target, or part of a broader strike zone, and this uncertainty matters. Because in modern conflict, perception can be just as powerful as reality. Even limited physical damage to a major civilian hub can send a global signal about vulnerability, escalation, and the shifting rules of engagement. But the deeper question is this: why this target? Why now? And what does it reveal about the strategic thinking behind this escalation? Now to the bigger picture, because what happened near Ben Gurion Airport is not just about impact zones or debris, it's about strategy. And in modern warfare, target selection often reveals more than official statements ever will. Ben Gurion Airport is not just Israel's primary civilian aviation hub. It is a critical national artery, handling the majority of international travel, cargo movement, and emergency evacuation capacity. In a crisis scenario, this airport becomes a lifeline for civilians leaving, for supplies coming in, and for maintaining global connectivity under pressure. So when a site like this becomes part of the threat landscape, it signals something deeper. Military and operational significance. While Ben Gurion is officially a civilian airport, its strategic value extends beyond commercial aviation. In times of heightened alert, major airports can support logistical coordination, rapid deployment, and emergency response operations. Disrupting such a node, even temporarily, can slow movement, complicate planning, and strain national response systems. From a military standpoint, forcing Israel to divert resources toward protecting civilian infrastructure creates operational pressure. Air defense systems, intelligence monitoring, and rapid response units must now cover a broader range of potential targets. That stretches capacity. And in conflict, stretching capacity is a strategy. Geographic leverage location matters. Positioned near Tel Aviv, Israel's economic and population center, Ben Gurion sits within a dense, high-value zone. Any threat to this area carries both symbolic and practical consequences. Symbolically, it sends a message. Even core civilian infrastructure is within reach. Practically, it introduces risk into one of the busiest and most sensitive regions in the country. Airspace restrictions ripple outward. Airlines reconsider routes. International confidence is tested, and when international confidence drops, economic pressure rises. Strategic signaling. This is where intent becomes critical. Targeting or even threatening. A location like Ben Gurion can serve as a signal rather than a purely destructive objective. It demonstrates capability, it tests response systems, it forces the opposing side to react under pressure. In strategic terms, this is about deterrence messaging. Iran's broader objective, as interpreted by many analysts, may not be limited to immediate damage. It may also involve showing that key Israeli infrastructure can be placed at risk, raising the stakes for any further escalation, shifting the balance. And here's where things take a turn. When civilian infrastructure enters the equation, the rules of engagement begin to blur. The conflict shifts from contained military exchanges to something more unpredictable, where economic systems, transportation networks, and civilian life become part of the strategic landscape. That increases pressure not just on Israel, but on international actors watching closely, especially the United States and its allies. Because once critical infrastructure is involved, escalation becomes harder to control. And the question now is no longer just about what happened. It's about how decision makers, military, political, and intelligence interpret what comes next. What are analysts and intelligence assessments saying at this hour? And how do they interpret a strike linked to Ben Gurion Airport? According to reporting cited by Reuters and Associated Press, Western and regional security officials are closely examining the pattern, timing, and targeting of these strikes. Early intelligence interpretations suggest this was not a random escalation, but part of a calculated signaling strategy, one designed to test Israel's defensive posture while demonstrating Iran's expanding operational reach. Intelligence community view, current intelligence. Linked analysis indicates that Iran's approach may follow a layered strategy. Phase 1, probe defenses with multiple launches. Phase 2, observe interception success rates. Phase 3, adjust targeting to maximize pressure points. Analysts warn that targeting areas near major infrastructure, even without catastrophic damage, can be strategically effective. It forces the defending side to allocate more resources, increases public anxiety, and introduces uncertainty into everyday systems like travel and logistics. One intelligence perspective describes this as pressure without full-scale destruction, a method aimed at destabilizing confidence rather than leveling infrastructure. Military analyst perspective. Military experts are focusing on capability. The fact that Iranian projectiles or their debris reached areas near a high-value civilian hub suggests that range, coordination, and timing were all successfully executed to some degree. Even partial penetration of defensive layers can be interpreted as a strategic signal. Experts also point out that modern missile systems are often used not just for impact, but for testing response systems. How quickly defenses activate where interception gaps may exist. How command structures respond under pressure. This kind of real-time testing provides valuable battlefield intelligence. Think tank and policy analysis. Geopolitical research institutions are framing this development within a broader escalation pattern. Analysts at major international security institutes suggest that the inclusion of infrastructure like airports reflects a shift toward expanded pressure tactics, where economic and civilian disruption becomes part of strategic calculus. Some policy experts warn that this approach increases the risk of unintended escalation. When civilian systems are affected, international pressure intensifies, and responses can become less predictable. Data and market signals. There are also measurable indicators. Energy markets have reacted sharply during this escalation phase, with earlier reports noting spikes in global oil prices. Aviation sectors are reassessing risk exposure. Insurance costs tied to regional operations are under review. These are not abstract signals. They are real-time indicators of how global systems respond to perceived instability. Across intelligence, military, and policy analysis, one theme is consistent. This is not just about a single strike. It is about signaling capability, testing defenses, and reshaping the psychological and strategic landscape of the conflict. But that raises an important question. Are all analysts interpreting this the same way? Or is there another perspective that challenges this narrative entirely? But the other side has a point. While many analysts interpret the strike pattern near Ben Gurion Airport as a calculated escalation by Iran, alternative perspectives suggest a more complex and potentially less deliberate scenario. Was the airport the actual target? One key question remains unresolved. Was Ben Gurion Airport the intended target, or simply within a broader strike zone? Some analysts argue that in high-intensity missile exchanges, especially those involving long-range systems, precision can degrade under combat conditions. Factors such as interception attempts, trajectory adjustments, and defensive countermeasures can alter where debris ultimately lands. From this perspective, what was reported near the airport may not necessarily indicate a direct targeting decision, but rather the byproduct of a wider engagement envelope. Defensive narrative versus strategic messaging. Israeli officials have emphasized that civilian infrastructure was placed at risk, reinforcing the narrative that this represents a dangerous escalation. That framing carries weight internationally. It shapes diplomatic responses and public perception. However, some observers caution that strategic messaging plays a role on both sides. Highlighting a major civilian site like Ben Gurion amplifies the perceived severity of the incident. It draws global attention. It increases political pressure on international partners. In other words, the way the event is described can influence how it is understood. Iranian perspective and justification from Iran's standpoint, or at least from narratives aligned with its position. The broader context matters. Iran has framed its actions as responses within an ongoing conflict environment, pointing to previous strikes, regional tensions, and long-standing security concerns. Some interpretations suggest that Iran's objective is not uncontrolled escalation, but controlled signaling within a conflict it views as already active. That distinction between escalation and response is central to how each side justifies its actions. Possibility of miscalculation. There is also a more concerning interpretation that this may reflect the risk of miscalculation rather than deliberate targeting. In fast-moving conflicts, where multiple systems are launched, intercepted, and redirected in seconds, unintended outcomes can occur. A projectile aimed at one location may end up impacting or being intercepted near another. If that is the case, then what appears to be a strategic signal could instead be an early sign of how quickly control can slip. Diplomatic and analytical debate within diplomatic and analytical circles. This debate is ongoing. FAWAS, this a precision message aimed at high-value infrastructure. FAR, an indirect consequence of broader military engagement. FAIS, escalation intentional, or emerging from rapid reaction cycles. There is no single agreed answer. And that uncertainty is exactly what makes this moment so volatile. Because when intentions are unclear, responses tend to be more cautious or more aggressive. And either path can change the trajectory of what happens next. Now to the global fallout, because what is unfolding between Iran and Israel is no longer contained to a single region. The ripple effects are already being felt across energy markets, military planning rooms, and everyday economic life. Economic shockwaves, one of the fastest reactions has come from global energy markets. According to Associated Press and Reuters, earlier phases of this escalation pushed oil prices sharply upward, with Brent crude crossing key thresholds amid fears of supply disruption. The Middle East remains one of the world's most critical energy corridors, and any threat to stability in this region sends immediate signals to traders and governments. If tensions continue, analysts warn of rising fuel costs globally, increased transportation expenses, broader inflation pressure, and that leads to a direct question for viewers. What does this mean for you if oil prices surge again? Gasoline prices in the United States and across many countries could climb rapidly. That affects daily commuting, shipping costs, airline tickets, and even food prices due to transportation expenses. Military and security implications. This escalation is also reshaping military calculations. Regional forces are on higher alert. Air defense systems are being reassessed. Strategic assets are being repositioned. Reports suggest increased monitoring and readiness across multiple countries concerned about spillover risk. For global powers, including the United States, this introduces difficult decisions, whether to increase military presence, how, to deter further escalation, how, to protect allies without widening the conflict. Each move carries risk. Geopolitical impact now to the broader geopolitical picture. Major global players are watching closely. Countries like Russia and China are analyzing the situation through strategic lenses, balancing their own interests, alliances, and long-term positioning. NATO members are also assessing potential implications for regional stability and collective security. Diplomatic channels are active, but under pressure. When infrastructure like Ben Gurion Airport becomes part of the threat environment, the stakes rise dramatically. It signals that the conflict is moving into a phase where economic systems, transportation networks, and civilian life are directly affected. Public impact and psychological effect. There is also a psychological dimension. Airspace restrictions, disrupted flights, and headlines involving major civilian hubs create a sense of uncertainty, not just locally, but globally. Travelers reconsider plans, businesses reassess risk. Governments issue advisories, confidence becomes fragile. The bottom line, this is no longer just a military confrontation. It is an economic event, a geopolitical event, a global stability test. And for millions of people watching, the effects may soon be felt far beyond the headlines. But the biggest question still remains: what happens next? As of this hour, the situation between Iran and Israel remains fluid, highly volatile, and still developing. Diplomatic channels are active. Military systems remain on alert, and intelligence agencies are closely monitoring every movement, every signal, every response. What to watch next? There are several key developments to watch in the coming hours and days. Military response. Will Israel escalate further in response to strikes linked to areas near Ben Gurion Airport? Iran's next move. Will Tehran signal de-escalation or continue strategic pressure? Positioning. Will the United States adjust its military or diplomatic posture in the region? Airspace and travel. Will aviation restrictions expand, affecting global travel routes? Energy markets. Will oil prices surge? Again, if tensions intensify, each of these factors could shift the trajectory of this conflict. Quickly, what we know, let's separate confirmed facts from uncertainty. Confirmed: Iranian missile activity has reached Israeli territory. Fay impact. Related debris has been linked to areas near Ben Gurion Airport. Fay Israeli authorities have restricted airport operations. Fay regional tensions have escalated. Significantly uncertain. Fay the exact targeting intent behind the strike. Fay the full scale and configuration of the weapons used. Fay weather. This marks the beginning of a broader escalation phase. Fay how global powers will ultimately respond to possible scenarios. Scenario 1. Escalation. If retaliatory cycles continue, this conflict could expand into a wider regional confrontation that may involve additional strikes, broader military engagement, and increased involvement from global powers. In this scenario, risks to energy markets, global stability, and civilian infrastructure all increase. Scenario 2. Controlled de-escalation. Diplomatic pressure could stabilize the situation back. Channel negotiations, international mediation, and strategic restraint might prevent further escalation. The conflict remains tense, but contained. This moment sits on a razor's edge. A single decision, military or political, could determine whether this becomes a prolonged regional crisis or a contained escalation that eventually stabilizes. And that is why this story matters. Because what happens next will not just shape the Middle East, it could influence global markets, international security, and everyday life far beyond the region. If you want clear fact-based analysis as this situation develops, make sure to subscribe and stay with us for continuing coverage as more information comes in. This is a developing story,